You're skeptical of the state. You're getting over the myth of authority.
But the state is still formidable. Or is it?
You've got a front row seat in the transition to a free society.
Let's dive headfirst into
The White Pill Box with your host, Mark Maresca.
Greetings all, thank you so much for joining today. In today's episode, I'm going to pose a thought experiment. It'll be targeted to any of you out there, but especially to the liberty communicators, and in particular, of course, to the self-identified anarchists, meaning anarcho-capitalists, voluntarists, etc. Anyone who holds the state as illegitimate, who holds stateless societies as the moral and practical alternative to government. Now, to get to that point in the discussion, I'll first cover what I call the sincerity of libertarian communicators. By that I mean, if they identify as anarchists, are they sincere about it? And spoiler alert, I think mostly they are sincere. And by the way, I'm including here both types of communicators, what I've called conventional and principled. So to start, I'll review what I mean by those terms. Conventional messaging takes a side on political issues. They really don't distinguish themselves that much from the Democrats, Republicans, left, right, or whatever flavor you want. When it's libertarians doing conventional messaging, they sound like everyone else because they are merely taking a particular position. I realize they commonly take a position that has libertarian aspects, but the audience usually doesn't conclude that the messenger is advocating for a stateless society, that government is illegitimate. Not at all. Instead, the communicator is strongly implying the state is legitimate. Indeed, they are validating this by focusing on some government policy position. They prefer to deal with statism today, on statism's terms, in hopes of getting the best outcome today. I think they might describe it as fighting for at least a slightly better world for their more immediate children and grandchildren. They want to see things improve faster for them. Nonetheless, conventional messengers believe the state is illegitimate and are anarchist at heart. But even though they believe it, they downplay their anarchist views. They just don't talk much about it. This all contrasts with principled messaging, where at some point at least the messenger is making clear they call into question the legitimacy of the state itself. They're drawing your attention to the myth of political authority in some context. They still may well be discussing contemporary issues, political figures, historical cases, whatever it may be, but they're clearly anti-statism. That message comes out loud and clear. They see their job as wanting to keep things on track toward a stateless society. They want to drive home the principles in order to more or less keep them alive. It's what's sometimes referred to as the remnant. I linked to an article on Mises.org about that. The remnant is a metaphor. Principled messengers see themselves as a group who want to keep important principles alive, keeping the moral flame alive, even in times when most everyone else compromises. By taking on the fight today, they are sparing their children's children of waging a moral battle or having to rediscover the principles. They won't have to rediscover the morality of liberty or fight for it as hard. By the way, I'm not going to get into the principled versus conventional messaging debate itself. I did that in episode 22 of my Myth of Authority series. Now, one very key aspect of both sides, one that I didn't mention, something they have in common, and this will tie tightly into the episode. Both sides see a free society as far off in the future. The principled see their job as keeping the light of hope alive along that long road. The conventional messengers see it as too far away to worry about, so let's deal with our problems today. Both see it as far off. To illustrate conventional messaging, I want to use one of our most showcased communicators in the liberty space today, Dave Smith. Dave is a comedian, podcaster, and communicator who's achieved a lot of exposure on very, very more mainstream platforms like Joe Rogan, Tucker Carlson, and so on. And he is well respected and has probably achieved more exposure than any speaker or messenger that I know of. So I'll be using Dave as very much representative of conventional messaging. As I said, identifying as anarchist, supporting the idea, but not saying all that much about it. And representative meaning you see this in almost any red-pilled person, self-declared libertarians or voluntarists, anarcho-capitalists. They will say that they believe in a free society, in a stateless society. They question the legitimacy of government. At the root, they believe a free society is better, is more moral, more practical than statism. But how often do they, as conventional messengers, actually communicate that? Not often. I think Dave is representative of believing in anarchism, but downplaying it most of the time. Now, Dave also sees a free society as a far future thing. So in that respect, he's also representative of the movement as a whole. In case there's any doubt, I'll play a clip of him here.
You know what's funny is that I've always gotten this for many, many years now. I've always gotten this thing, which I always find kind of interesting, is a lot of people, like when I do Rogan, like when I do big podcasts, so people who are hearing me for the first time, or maybe they've heard me a couple times, but they don't like know me that well. But they would say that, and I got this comment a lot. They would say that what they like about me is that I'm a centrist. A lot of people would go like, I like that Dave comes on and just like, it's just common sense centrist stuff. And it's funny because I am not at all a centrist.
So already we see a hint of what I'm referring to. He's observing that those who don't know him well, at least not well enough after just hearing him for a few episodes or hear him on a panel, essentially assume he's centrist. They absolutely do not come away thinking he's anarchist, that he thinks the government is illegitimate, that he advocates a stateless society. They absolutely don't get that. And instead, from whatever commentary he does make, they derive that he's centrist, that he's moderate, not extreme. He doesn't come off as extreme left. He doesn't come off extreme right. To them, he must be centrist. Now, let's understand this. Dave does have a talent for expressing himself in a common sense way. So it's a natural assumption people might first make about him that he's centrist. But take note, though, that his particular comment here shows he's somewhat puzzled or amused. He finds it odd that people assume he's centrist when he knows he's not. So let me continue now.
But I'm trying to think, like, who is actually more radical than me in their political views? I mean, I'm an ANCAP. I'm an anarchist. You know what I mean? I'm also like a pragmatic anarchist. So like, I don't think that like the governments are going to be abolished anytime soon and we'll just have a market economy for government. I'm not saying that's going to happen anytime soon, but like, I do think that is the correct position.
Okay, so that was the key part that I wanted to illustrate, that he is comfortable coming right out and saying, I'm an anarchist, I'm an anarcho-capitalist. He laid it out there. He's fine with it, proud of it. He says it, no shame, no guilt, no hiding. He's not concerned with how it comes off. But he rarely says that. Even if you haven't heard a lot of his content, you'd figure that, because he already said people hear him and assume he's centrist. Clearly, they don't hear him say what he just said often. And it's true, in fact, on his show, on the shows that feature him, mostly it's conventional political discussions. Take a snapshot of most of his content, and you would assume he takes for granted the state is legitimate. It's the way things are and the way things ought to be. And I don't think you can blame most people for assuming what looks to them as a common sense approach to government policy. So I actually don't find it odd that they'd conclude that he's not radical. In fact, if they heard him calling himself anarchist, I'd imagine they would think he's radical. But he's not saying that, mostly. Now, he does say it, in fairness, like you just saw, though mostly when he's with fellow anarchists like Michael Malice, then they will talk in those terms. Now, note that he also added he considers himself a pragmatic anarchist, and he explained that by saying he doesn't think that a free society is coming anytime soon. That'll be relevant in a minute. And again, that's quite representative of much of the movement, believing in anarchism, but not often saying it publicly, dealing with statism on its own terms, plus believing a free society is far, far off? Well, that's for sure representative of pretty much most of us. To really solidify this in your mind, then let me ask you to consider that last part. Now, let's say Dave, for some reason, had strong confidence that a free society was not so far off, that it might actually be more around the corner. Ask yourself if you think he would still focus on the conventional political topics, would still want to deal with the state on statism's terms. Would he still rarely mention anarchism and a stateless society? We'll circle back to this. Now, at this point, I want to discuss a few assumptions I'm making. Dave has drawn criticism, so I want to make clear this discussion is not for criticizing him or even the movement in general. First of all, is he sincere when he says he's an anarchist? I'm assuming yes. It usually doesn't benefit to call yourself that. He actually does risk losing big names who host him. He may downplay it, but he hasn't hidden it. I take this to mean he's sincere in his belief. And he probably could get even more market share by using his talent to cozy up to real mainstream views. He doesn't. Another assumption I'm making is that Dave is well-read. He's intelligent. I think that one's obvious. I don't consider myself the most well-read person out there, but everything I've read, he's read. And he's read even more. He's well-spoken, fluent in the concepts. He may not always nail it perfectly, but very often he does. It seems clear he understands them about as well as most of us do. I'm not saying he's the smartest of all. He's not a scholar, not a philosopher, but he knows his stuff, and I think we have to acknowledge that. I'm acknowledging it. Here again, most libertarians are reasonably well-read, at least the serious ones. Again, it's why Dave is a decent representation. Also, as a debater, it seems clear he can think on his feet. He's good at that. That skill may not represent the rest of us, but I want to acknowledge he's good at that too. Okay, so to be clear, I'm stating, I hope, obvious, valid assumptions about Dave and the movement. Nothing personal here as either a criticism or false praise. So we have here a clue to why they don't mention anarchism more often, much more often, if that's our fundamental goal. They understand how and why, economically and morally, free societies are better for peace and prosperity among human beings, yet they don't mention it. I think many will explain it by saying it doesn't sell, so to speak. They don't think the audience is ready to hear it. It's too radical. I get that, but I think that ties into the real reason they downplay anarchism. It circles back to what I said. They don't believe a free society is forthcoming. They don't see it at all in the near future. And Dave touched on that in the clip. Most libertarians, most anarchists, don't think a free society is around the corner. Yes, they say people aren't ready to hear the ideas, but I believe they think that because they assume a free society is so far off. Okay, so now we should ask why they think this, why they say it's 100 years or more. By the way, I asked myself that because I assumed it too, like all of you, principled or conventional. And it sure seems like a good assumption. We see how hard it is to change people's minds, how it's slow. So it just seemed logical that it's something far, far in the future. And that satisfies us. It's the end of the analysis. It'll just take super long. But if we dig deeper, a slightly more sophisticated answer would go like this. We don't seem anywhere near a free society today. Been like that in all of our history. But notice we're assuming it does happen someday. No more governments. We'll see stateless societies. But wait, that will be like the opposite of today, where there's only government societies. It's 100% state today, and eventually it'll be 0% state. A complete flip. Well, guess what? If you have a flip like that, there's going to be a transition period, getting from the one condition to the opposite. I'm calling it the inflection point. Let me illustrate that with a simple graph. Now, again, I acknowledge this is a very, very simple graph. It's to illustrate how changes happen relatively quickly. There's this long static period. Nothing changes. Then at some point, the right conditions happen. They start to alter the curve upward, and eventually it curves to the line being almost vertical and remains that way after that. One static condition here changes into an opposite static condition. The inflection point is where it changes, and that usually happens quickly. Let's take slavery. Slavery existed through most of all human history. And then somewhere in the early mid-1800s, we reached an inflection point. Enough changes were happening all around society to where slavery was starting to be questioned. It was starting to be considered illegitimate. That happened at a very, very early stage of the transition, and then it accelerated. All this tight curve here covered only about 50 years, from about the early 1800s to about the late 1800s. And then we didn't have slavery anymore. So you can see that something that was persistent for all of human history changed very quickly and then no longer existed. We have another example in the fall of the Soviet Union. This flat section here is the 70 or 80 so years that the solid Soviet Union government persisted. And then in the very late 1980s, right in that time frame, is when the Soviet Union fell. And it happened very quickly. A matter of years, if that, compared to the many years it persisted. And once it was over, it was over. No more legitimacy of the Soviet Union government, and it vanished forever. So I look at this as illustrative of also how a free society will eventually arrive. We have statism, the myth of authority, persisting through all of human history. So think of this here as 4000 BC, all the way to some point where the transition, the erosion of the myth of authority, starts. It takes a while to get going, then accelerates until finally the myth can't hold the state up anymore. We're stateless from then on. Most of the whole human story, earliest times to our future, is spent stable. Persistent government going back all the way, then eventually persistent stateless world going forward, hopefully forever. But the transition, that doesn't take long compared to all the rest of human history. Now, if a free society is coming, there would need to be necessary factors all converging right then when a transition can get started. That's what makes the inflection happen. Now, what about where we are along the path? If you're here way before the transition, there's no way to tell when it'll get. If you are here, right there, early in that inflection point, you still have to look to find the signs of the myth of authority eroding. It's not right in your face yet. It actually doesn't look much different from back here. But now let's move a bit further on. Once it gains steam, finally, we'll see clear signs of it happening, proof that those necessary factors have converged. Then it becomes more and more evident. And then further, eventually, it's unmistakable. It's happening. Here, stateless. Okay, now, get ready, because we've missed something obvious, all of us, and I include myself in this until only recently, actually. I was no different from any red-pilled libertarian, Dave, etc. Check it out. We are obviously, right now, pre-free society, somewhere on that flat part of the curve. And sure, a free society is ahead of us. But what's ahead of us first, before a free society? Obviously, the transition, the inflection point. So we never thought to think it through. It's not about looking for the signs of a free society. It's about the signs of the transition. As I said, if you are at that early stages, early in that inflection point, the signs are hard to see. So the way things look early in that inflection point compared to the way things looked all back through history are about the same. So let's be fair. Right now, for libertarians, Dave, all of us, we don't notice any obvious signs. So there you go. The obvious assumption, a free society is still far off. We can assume we are back in that flat part of the graph and not really likely to be at the inflection point. The kicker is, it looks like that even if we really turn out to be right there at the inflection point. An understandable assumption. The transition is still far off. So I don't fault the movement, Dave, myself, anyone, for not questioning this. We haven't been looking. but also kind of didn't need to. There were no tangible, plausible signs to indicate we were near an inflection point. We figured when it happens, we'll know. There'll be reasons for thinking it's coming. Except for this. While no one was looking, it's gone ahead and started. The inflection point has started. Those indicators, psychological, technological, they're out there now, sitting there for us to see. All we got to do is look. That's what I did in my Myth of Authority series. I just looked. The factors that would need to happen have converged in just the recent decade. I won't try to convince you of that here. I dove super deeply into that in my Myth of Authority series. Instead, let's do a thought experiment. Suppose we have a crystal ball or some kind of time viewer that permits us to look 15 or 20 years ahead of where we are right now. For example, if you have small kids today, they're just about becoming adults. I want you to suppose that skepticism of the state is highly and tangibly underway. The world is by no means stateless at all, but in that 20-year view, in terms of the libertarian or anarchist community, the arguments are over. There is no debate about the when anymore. We're headed there. It is enough in the air that pretty much everyone knows we've turned the corner. The legitimacy of the state is not completely eroded yet. The myth of authority still hangs in there, but nothing like it is now. Maybe even there's a few stateless societies that have started to form. They haven't been around all that long, maybe a year or two, but assume those experiments are underway in that time frame through the viewer we're looking at. All that together means there are clear, tangible signs that the state's days are numbered. You can see us transitioning organically and inevitably. Okay, now we turn off that viewer and we sit and ponder a while. Let's ask an interesting question. Knowing the inflection point has started and gets its legs in about 15 to 20 years. If you knew that, would anything you are doing today regarding messaging change? Would you be doing exactly what you're doing today still, knowing that? Or would your calculations change in some way with that knowledge? So back to Dave Smith, meaning the movement in general. My question would be this. If they did this thought experiment, seeing a 15 to 20 year future where the transition is unmistakably underway, the myth of authority noticeably eroding, would their messaging be any different? I'm genuinely curious about that. What would our most prominent messengers do differently? Michael Malice, Dave Smith, all of them, Larkin Rose, Keith Knight, etc. Speculate what they would do differently, or if they would do anything different. I'd be curious what you think. Hey, if any of them happen to be listening to this very podcast, I'd hope they'd let me know directly. And then what would you do different? And also, I'm curious, if you don't think you would change anything at all, meaning if you would say, I would continue to do exactly what I'm doing now, even if I knew that's what the horizon looked like, well, then I would ask, at what stage of that inflection point, of that trend upward, at what stage would you finally change your messaging? When would that be along the path, if not now in 2025? How obvious would it have to get before you think your messaging would change? What would your answer be personally? I'd like you, the viewers, to ponder this. Let me know if any of you want to come on the show and talk about it. Just drop me a comment. Let me start to wrap up by saying something about my own perspective. You know, I remember the early movement starting in the 1970s. The hope, confidence we had wasn't from real-world signs. It was abstract, like expecting the ideas to eventually catch on, work their way through the culture, trust in the resilience of human beings, trust in their tendency to learn with enough time, the overall trend toward individual rights, how ideas tend to get better with time, even if it takes, yes, centuries. That was sort of the framework. We had hope since we had nothing explicitly tangible to go on. Best we could do. We didn't have the internet. We did have solid public school indoctrination, only a few major media outlets, so propaganda was relentless. Any guess about timelines at that time would have been only a guess, and were only guesses. But now I tell you my perspective on this has changed. Yes, I know full well the future is uncertain. I know there's lots of timelines we can imagine seeing in a viewer like that. A full-on 1984 police state, a nuclear war, or things just stay the same for 50 years. Or things change, but not for 100 years or 1,000 years. Lots of timelines. But now I'm fairly convinced that what I suggested in that viewer is the most likely outcome over the next 15 or 20 years. The factors needed have come together, and they're evident if you look. Again, I encourage you to listen to the series, which I link to, and decide for yourself. So I have a very, very white-pilled outlook. I'm more positive than ever about our chances. And it's not just a white pill that the transition has started, but this too, another white pill, and I can vouch for it. Once you look, once you do see it, you see it all over. So I hope I've given you something to think about. I look forward to your input and your comments on this. I'd love to continue to explore this. And with that, I think we'll wrap things up right about there for today. Take care and see you next time.
Thanks so much to all subscribers and everyone who joined today. And remember, keep looking for those white pills.